Welcome to The Thing About Austen, a podcast about Jane Austen's world. I'm Zan.
And I'm Diane. And this episode, we're talking about Mary's Concerto. For this episode, we are so excited to welcome back our guest, Dr. Lidia Chang. Lidia is a flutist and musicologist whose work examines the intersection of gender, literature, print culture, organology, and music performance practices in Europe during the long 18th century, including the gendering power of musical instruments, as well as questions of aesthetics, sound ideals, technology, reception history, and historical performance practices that influenced musical styles. She has presented her research at the Jane Austen Society of North America's annual and regional meetings, the American Musicological Society, and the North American British Music Studies Association, among others, and is currently on the faculty at Colorado College. Welcome, Lidia!
Thanks so much for having me back on the show. Such a pleasure to talk with you guys.
Oh, always exciting to get to talk about these sorts of things.
For this episode, we are in the early chapters of Pride and Prejudice. Netherfield Park has been let at last, hooray! And the Netherfield and Longbourn households are now acquainted. During a gathering at Lucas Lodge, Charlotte, Elizabeth, and Darcy are engaged in a brief conversation and, a little bit of banter for Elizabeth and Darcy, when Charlotte announces that she is going to open up the instrument, which means that Lizzie will be expected to play.
Okay, so this is from the book, and it's starting out by talking about Lizzie's performance. So here we have it. Her performance was pleasing, though by no means capital. After a song or two, and before she could reply to the entreaties of several that she would sing again, she was eagerly succeeded at the instrument by her sister Mary, who, having in consequence of being the only plain one in the family, worked hard for knowledge and accomplishments, was always impatient for display. Mary had neither genius nor taste, and though vanity had given her application, it had given her likewise a pedantic air and conceited manner, which would have injured a higher degree of excellence than she had reached. Elizabeth, easy and unaffected, had been listened to with much more pleasure, though not playing half so well. And Mary, at the end of a long concerto, was glad to purchase praise and gratitude by Scotch and Irish airs at the request of her younger sisters, who, with some of the Lucases and 2 or 3 officers, joined eagerly in dancing at one end of the room. Okay, so Mary is very, very ready to play, but her concerto is not in high demand. So let's start with that. Lidia, let's kind of jump in. What is a concerto? Can you tell us a bit about the history of this particular type of composition and how it might be coming into this kind of musical repertoire of someone like Mary Bennet?
So the concerto is a genre of instrumental music that began to emerge in the late 17th, early 18th century, and it persisted through the 19th century. Maybe worth mentioning already at the outset that the plural of concerto is concerti, but sometimes you'll hear people say concertos. And if that's what you say, don't worry, nobody cares. And everybody knows what you mean. So concerti is the proper plural, and I'll talk about concerti grossi, which is also a plural of concerto grosso. So there's solo concerti written for one solo instrument like violin or flute or keyboard like fortepiano and with orchestral accompaniment. And then there's also what are called concerti grossi, which are written for 2, 3, 4 solo instruments with orchestral accompaniment. And some of the most famous early composers in these genres were Corelli, Vivaldi. Some of your listeners may be familiar with the Four Seasons. And a bit later then there's Handel and Bach. If you know the Brandenburg Concerti, those are Concerti Grossi by Bach. And by the time we get to the period when Austen lived, Mozart was probably the most popular and prolific writer of concerti. But we really don't see any concerti in the music books that Jane Austen herself compiled. There is one by a William Evans, a composer who nobody has ever heard of. And this concerto for fortepiano was printed sometime between 1785, 1795. And it made it into this collection of bound printed music of Jane Austen's. And it's printed like I imagine many concerti would have been printed for young ladies to play in such a way we call a piano reduction. So whereas a concerto would have a solo piano part and then a lot of other parts written for all the string players in the orchestra, a piano reduction compresses all of that into one part for just one piano to play, so that a young lady might be able to play the whole thing by herself, obviously without an orchestra. But the concerto is really a genre more for large-scale public entertainment, not for the drawing room. It's a genre that showcases the virtuosity of a soloist, or several soloists. And so for a young lady, this was really not the point of her musical education. All of her practicing was not in pursuit of great musical virtuosity, but rather, I forget if it's Erasmus Darwin who talks about that these accomplishments are supposed to keep a young lady's impressionable mind pleasantly occupied and free of dangerous imaginations, right? That wonderful quote. But Mary Bennet, for example, is sort of doing something different, right? She is pursuing music with a goal of great virtuosity.
So like in terms of acquiring this type of music, like, the sheet music to actually learn these pieces, is this the kind of thing that Mary could have just picked up in Meryton? Would she have had to send away for them? We know that they had a rather indifferent education in the Bennet household. So obviously this isn't something that's like being given to her by a governess or something like that, because they don't have one.
She probably would have sent away for it or been a subscriber to a particular composer or to a publishing house, and then would receive music from that subscription. And it could have included concerti.
So Lydia, from this description that Austen provides, we get the sense that Mary's actually not a bad technical musician. She's perceived as unpleasant to listen to due to her general air while at the instrument, and maybe perhaps because it's not what everybody wants to hear. But you don't get the sense from Austen that she's like clomping her way down the keys, right? That she's completely unskilled as a musician. So can you talk to us a little bit more about why Mary's choice of a concerto is noteworthy here? And what is it about this performance that's really not working for this audience?
Yeah, this is a really, really good question. And I think something that makes Mary's musical skills really fascinating in this novel. Because the thing about Mary is that she does music really well. But for a woman that's in this period, and especially a woman of her social class, she does it wrong. She's just doing it wrong, even while she's doing it well. So to understand her musical skills and what they tell us about her as a character, we have to consider them within the broader context of how Mary is performing her gender and her social class throughout the novel in other ways. So Mary is often described as pursuing accomplishments that would have been understood as masculine to Austen's readers. For example, instead of reading novels, she reads great books and makes extracts, and she studies in her hours of repose. I think there's one scene described where after tea in the evenings, she and her father both retire to their respective places of study, he to his library and she to her instrument. Often it comes up that she doesn't want to go on a walk with her sisters or do the things that her sisters like to do because she's too busy studying and being very serious about her studies. She even really rates her intellectual abilities so highly that when she's briefly considering whether or not she would marry Mr. Collins, if the opportunity presents itself, she says that she's impressed with the solidity of his reflections, but thinks that he's not as clever as she is. And if they were to marry, that maybe she'd be a good influence on him and get him to read the right books and therefore make him into a good companion. So Mary's academic and intellectual interests would have been understood not just as unusual, but as distinctly unladylike. And her musical sensibility also paint her in a kind of masculine light. So when she plays a long concerto instead of Scotch and Irish airs, the concerto, as I mentioned before, was this genre meant for large-scale public entertainment. And as such, it was performed by men, professional musicians, so working-class men, in public for money. So the concerto as a genre, has these layers of association that skew away from the virtuous domestic female musician, which contributes to Mary's characterization as not appropriately feminine. And what's more is that she studies the thorough bass, right, which is also called basso continuo, figured bass. It's a kind of guitar tabs for the harpsichord that emerged during the Baroque era. And by Jane Austen's day, it would have been really outdated and totally superfluous to the musical education of a lady. During that period, the music that ladies were expected to play would have been fully written out for them. So thorough bass was considered a subject within the study of music theory, the science of music, and because it was not really, it no longer had a practical application. And so while a young lady would not have studied thorough bass, a young man might have, and especially a young man of the working class who intended to become a professional musician.
Well, it's so funny, that line, too, where they found Mary, as usual, deep in the study of thorough bass and human nature.
Right.
She's studying thorough bass. She's reading deep philosophy.
Reading Hume, like
yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Well, and one of the things that's really interesting to me, Lydia, based on what you were just talking about too, is not only that there's the gendered element to her performance of the concerto, but that there is a class element to what she's performing as well. The fact that this is something that is paid entertainment, that the fact that she's performing beyond not just her gender, but also beyond her class. Well, and even in the passage that we read at the top, where it talks about how she's kind of purchasing praise and gratitude by the Scotch airs, and so that there's kind of like this like commerce element that I would never have noticed without that context.
There is this element of transaction in that passage, and yes, how inappropriate for a young lady of her class to appear to be having purchasing power.
Yeah.
I mean, you can really get the sense of her as she's like the serious one at the party, and everyone's like, okay, stop playing the really serious music that we have to really focus on to appreciate. Can you just play something we can dance to? Switch the radio station to something more fun.
Right, and that's part of it too, that like the point of a young lady's musical education was, besides keeping her dainty little mind free of dangerous imaginations, but also to give pleasure to her family and her friends and the company, and to also, on the topic of class, show that she had this leisure time. She didn't have to work or cook or do anything, that she could just play the piano, and this reflected well on her family, reflected their class very well.
Well, because I mean, like a concerto is also not like a Scotch or Irish reel that takes 2 or 3 minutes, whereas a concerto can be quite extensive. The time commitment alone is kind of daunting.
People are like shifting around in their chairs, like, okay, are we almost done? Oh, she's still going.
Right. We're thinking like 3 movements, and she plays all of it. That's like 20, 25 minutes, right?
Yeah. People are like, I was not prepared for this. I just, should have grabbed a snack before we sat down. But one of the things that I think is really interesting is that we do have another public performance from Mary in Austen's novel. And this is a little bit later. This is at the Netherfield Ball. And in this scene, singing rather than piano playing is the focus of the performance. And Austen writes, Mary's powers were by no means fitted for such a display. Her voice was weak and her manner affected. This is a much less flattering performance for Mary, specifically because her voice is called out as weak. Is it safe to assume that Mary is playing the piano while accompanying this singing? And why do you think Austen would set the singing scene as a musical counterpart to the concerto scene?
Yes, so we can assume that she's playing the piano accompaniment to her own singing here. So coming back to that passage that you just read, at the Netherfield Ball, she tries to do music the way young ladies are supposed to. So in that scene when it opens, it says, when supper was over, singing was talked of, and Mary, after very little entreaty, decided to oblige the company. So this is all good and right, that a young lady is supposed to kind of read the room, see, what people want to hear, and then go in and do that. And usually it was this kind of very particular kind of female music making, which was ballad singing or singing an aria with your own piano accompaniment. And she's just not good at that. And I think that's what the narrator points out when she says her powers were by no means fitted to such a display. So she's good along concerto, but when it comes to this very much more female identifying kind of music for this period, music making for this period, she's not good at it. That's not her skill set. And I think what's more is that the narrator observes that, quote, such an opportunity of exhibiting was delightful to her. So she also wants to perform, and this runs back into the class issue of musical performance being the purview of the working class. And she's only supposed to want to play in as much as it is appreciated and wanted by the people around her, not to show off her skills.
You're supposed to be like, oh no, I couldn't. Oh, okay. Just one song. Okay, yes. Okay.
Right.
This is also feeling a little bit like what we talked about with Mary's harp, where Mary Crawford is very much so playing an aesthetic instrument, and her performance is very aesthetic minded, right? Edmund is like, yeah, I'm here to, air quotes, listen to the music, right? He's actually just watching Mary play. Whereas Mary Bennet is trying to do not an aesthetic performance. She's trying to do a performance, right? She's trying to do, take the stage, take the attention, and it's kind of different. And I can see that difference a little bit more.
And it's a very good point to bring up this sort of aesthetic nature of music performance. We have to remember that Mary Bennet is the only plain one, right? So then again, this adds another layer to the performance where she's compared unfavorably to her sister, right? As we understand Lizzie Bennet to be much prettier than Mary Bennet. And so the auditor is also the viewer, right? Watching these performers, and poor Mary Bennet, she's just not very pretty. And this does not help her musical performance.
Part of what the audience is looking for is not just what they're getting orally, but also what they're getting visually, right? It's right. Sort of like you're taking in this whole tableau of a beautiful woman at the instrument, and there's a little bit of a soundtrack playing in the background whilst you admire her.
Right.
It's one of those scenes where you kind of play it in your head and you just feel so bad for her. And you sort of hope that, I hope she doesn't realize how nobody is into this. Obviously, it's not the case. Obviously, she does know because she's told okay, that's enough, and sort of ushered away from the instrument.
Yeah, I think that line, when it's delivered in any adaptation from her father, you've exhibited enough, kind of that line is just, that is soul crushing,
Yeah, she's probably one of the more talented characters in Austen's novels when it comes to musical skill. I think if we're just talking about forte pianists, I think Mary Bennet seems to really know what she's about and to study thorough bass. I mean, it's not an easy skill to have, and to be self-taught at it, I imagine too, is something to be admired. And that she gets no praise really for it is, quite sad for us, modern day readers. We feel sympathy, but I think that Austen's readers would have just thought she was funny and ridiculous.
So we do get another concerto mentioned from Austen when Marianne plays a concerto at Barton Park in Sense and Sensibility. So while Eleanor and Lucy Steele are discussing Edward, quote, Marianne was then giving them the powerful protection of a very magnificent concerto.
The drama that's going on behind that conversation.
So what do you make of the parallels between Marianne and Mary's choice of the concerto as a piece for public performance, and, also just the perceptions of Marianne and Mary by the other characters?
Yeah, no, this is a really good question, and really goes to show why we have to see the whole character in the broader context of how they're behaving, right? Because unlike Marianne uses music as a conduit for her many and very big feelings, right?
Capital B, capital F, big feelings. Yeah,
big feelings. Yeah, she's really a product of the 18th century cult of sensibility. And so she's interested in nature and the sublime and knowing the world through her senses. Whereas Mary Bennet is kind of a nerdy Enlightenment loser by comparison. She's interested in acquiring knowledge through diligent study and contemplation and knowing the world through her mind, right? So where Playing Along Concerto contributes to the characterization of Mary as manly and ridiculous. For Marianne, it contributes her characterization as a big R romantic. And Marianne also doesn't seem to care who listens, right? When Marianne plays this concerto, she plays for her own gratification. Like, it helps the plot and the scene along, like that she's providing this sonic cover for the conversation that's happening. But really, she's not aware of what's going on. She's just playing because she wants to. She's playing for her own gratification, whereas Mary wants to show off her skills and her virtuosity in a way that's much more in line with how a professional musician, who of course at that time would have been a man, would perform for an audience.
And considered much less acceptable for a lady to be like, and now I will play you my concerto. Whereas Marianne's just kind of like, I just happen to be here in the corner doing my thing because I don't want to talk to any of you people. So
exactly, yeah. Yeah. And also, of course, Marianne, we have to remember, is a lot prettier than Mary Bennet.
Oh, yeah, interesting. So it's like it gives her maybe a little bit of latitude that Mary does not have with the audience around her as well.
Yeah.
Oh, and this scene, too, is also taking place in kind of like the drawing room where there aren't men present. And so her performing a concerto is kind of more, as you said, I mean, it's not a public performance for her. It's very much so like, it's just a bunch of ladies in the room. Nobody's watching me, nobody here cares. So she's, again, given a lot more latitude. And I think that makes sense in that context as well.
That's such a good point. Yeah, to remember that it matters a bit less. It gives her more latitude.
Well, this is, I don't know if this will make the tape or anything, but I have a board book of Sense and Sensibility, the Baby Lit board book on Sense and Sensibility. And on one of the pages, it has Marianne playing noisy music. And on the other page where it's trying to like, the opposite is quiet. And so it's her piano but they have a piece of sheet music put on there and it says, very noisy music by Beethoven.
Yeah.
And I think it's just so perfect.
I don't know that piece, but
that's great. It feels appropriate to this scene particularly, right?
Well, Lidia, thank you so much for coming on again to talk to us about another Mary, a different Mary, and her music. So, like Marys and their music. This is like the Thing About Austin niche that you're doing now. So where can our listeners follow you, find out about any cool projects you have going on, anything like that?
Well, I'm on Instagram at Lidia AC. You can find me at my website, lidiachang.com.
Thank you again, Lidia, for coming on.
Thank y'all. It's my pleasure.
Thank you again to Dr. Lidia Chang for coming on this episode. You can find us on Instagram at The Thing About Austin and on Twitter at Austin_things. You can also check out our website, thethingaboutaustin.com, and email us at thethingaboutaustin@gmail.com.
Stay tuned for next episode when we'll be talking about John Thorpe's gig.
Thanks for listening. Bye!